So we're going to talk about opportunity zones. I'm just going to give like a very quick overview because there's probably disparate knowledge of the program. So it was a tax incentive that was passed as part of Trump's Tax Reform Act of 17. And what it provides investors the opportunity to roll realized capital gains, whether they be from stocks, bonds, baseball cards, real estate monnaies, into a qualified opportunity fund, and they get 3 tax benefits. One is they defer the payment of capital gains until 2027. They get a reduction on the deferred tax liability of 15 or 10%, depending upon when they make investment. And importantly, the third benefit, which is the largest, any capital appreciation on an investment made in a qualified opportunity zone, if held for 10 years, is tax-free. There's no capital gain. This is very important in how it works in that it doesn't turn a bad investment into a good investment. It acts as an amplifier. And in that regard, it can turn an average investment into good, good into great, and great into awesome. So I'm going to start off with our panel, and I'm going to go to John first. John is sort of the godfather of the program. And John, in a prior life, I worked in LA city government, and I got exposed to things like enterprise zones and new market tax credits, and they seemed very promising, but in actuality, they all sucked. Why doesn't this suck?
Thanks. That's a good question to start with. So opportunity zones was designed to be a fundamental departure from the way that the federal government has incentivized capital to move into communities in the past. And there have been some merits to those programs. I don't think they all sucked. But they were all limited in terms of their scale, in terms of their flexibility, and in terms of how nimble the capital could be in moving into market opportunities in the designated areas. And so what opportunity zones was designed to do was decentralize that process. Rather than have a central intermediary doling out tax credits or doling out grants or serving as the gatekeeper, it was really to connect the communities themselves with a tool that could attract capital from the marketplace and do that in a permissionless way, so to speak. As long as you were operating within the lines, and as long as the capital was going to the uses that Congress intended, there's a lot of flexibility that was allowed there. So what this can do is scale to the market in a frictionless way. You don't have a cap every year of the amount of capital that can move into the communities. You don't have a designated number of communities within the opportunity zones that are limited on investment. You don't have a narrow lane. This is not just for real estate. It's not just for a certain type of business. And right now you see this already, even in the infancy stages of this policy, you see a wide diversity of types of investments and types of communities seeing the benefit of new capital coming in. And that really reflects the design features that were baked into this to try to get away from more of a static model of an ad hoc, one project here, one project there, and within a community to allow for a diversity of investments that could really lift that community up. So everything from real estate, manufacturing, clean tech, startup businesses, incubators, that full spectrum, and many, many more creative use cases. That's the essence of opportunity zones. It's allowing for a diversity of mutually reinforcing investments to happen in a given place without the federal government serving as the intermediary on each and every deal. And that's a big departure from where we've seen in the past.
Okay, I'm going to have a speed round question here. I think I know Manny's answer, but I'm going to start with Manny. I just want a number from each of you. How much money do you think is going to go into the Opportunity Zone program? Now, Laura said you believe it's $1 trillion. Is $1 trillion your number, Manny?
So I think $1 trillion of equity will go in. Please remember, you must put in equity. With that $1 trillion of equity will go another $3 trillion of debt.
All right.
Especially because every investment here is effectively Community Reinvestment Act, so the debt is especially attractive.
John, give me a number.
I don't have a number. I think it's.
Come on, you got to play the game.
I think it's in the hundreds of
entertainment.
billions.
We're in Vegas. Give me a number.
Easily in the hundreds of billions. I'd say 500 billion is an aspirational target.
500 billion. Dan.
Treasury is easy. We said 100 billion as well.
No, that's what Treasury says. What do you say?
I think 100 is a good number.
Russ?
I say around 50 billion.
50 billion. Okay.
But 50 billion can't be right because there's already 50 billion of projects that are started.
This is
so
good.
Even
This is good when we argue. No, I want
it's a ridiculous number because you can just count it on your hand now.
Look, I think there's going to be a lot of money that goes into opportunity zones. It just won't be successful investments. So when I talk about the number of dollars going in, there's a lot of hype around these programs. There's a lot of push to make this stuff happen, but at the basic level, it has to be a fundamentally good real estate trade.
So I'm not talking about
when
real
we
estate.
talk about that, I don't doubt that there'll be lots of money.
Right, I'm exercising moderator prerogative.
I'm talking about business. That's the key factor here.
Right.
Jobs, jobs, jobs. Not real estate, but jobs. And that is all business.
Right. Okay, so I have a question for you. So we're
who's
all trying to roll.
business?
Manny, Russ, and I are all in the business of raising capital for opportunity funds. I think we would all admit it has been slow. And what I've said is opportunity zones are like high school sex. Everyone's talking about it, and no one's doing it. So Manny, why is it?
I think that will change, right? Because
that will change. Well, high schoolers eventually have
rules.
sex, right? It just takes time.
But Brett, you're talking about a 9-inning game where
No, Manny, hold it.
The game hasn't started. The warm-up pitches are just being thrown. We only had rules 1 week ago.
I know it's Dan's fault.
1 week ago.
I know, it's Dan's fault.
But they're good rules, so you should at least be happy with that.
So Manny, do you attribute the slowness to the delay in regs, or are there other things that you would attribute it to?
Whenever you have a gigantic change, it takes a while for people to adjust. The first adjustment will be by the cutting-edge players. So you already see Amazon building Northern Virginia. Try to build in Long Island City. Google, 20,000 jobs. The tip of New York, opportunity zone. Micron, Northern Virginia. Johnson & Johnson just announced a project in Washington, D.C., opportunity zone, a lab next to Children's Hospital. DHL just announced a $150 million project in the middle of South Carolina. Okay. So you have to remember, you're in such an early stage. It takes time for this to happen.
Right. I hear you. I agree with that. It's Dan's fault. I think also this is a 10-year investment. And I don't know about other people here. I've never made a 10-year investment. I've had some investments that have ended up being 10 years because they didn't work out. So I'm getting distributions in year 12 or 13 when it was supposed to be a 6 or 7-year investment. But I do think that takes time. There's another possibility which I want to pose to Dan. Do we think the incentives are priced appropriately, right? In other words, are they generous enough? So if Manny's right and $1 trillion goes into opportunity zones, there will be some that will say that it was priced too generously, that we gave too much to rich guys, right? The incentives were too much. If the thing's a dud, let's just say, and $20 billion goes into opportunity zones, right? Just somehow. I mean, we've all lived through 08, so we accept that anything is possible. Then we would say that the incentives were priced too low. What makes you confident that the incentives are appropriately priced?
Well, ultimately, the incentives are what Congress gave us, right? I mean, it is very attractive to achieve the deferral of capital gains and not have to pay the tax on that. That is worth money to every investor who invests in opportunity zones. And if you are in for the long haul, the 10-year hold and the abatement of capital gains taxes for the 10-year hold can be very attractive. What I would say is the pricing for opportunity zones is enough to make you look at areas that you would not have looked for before. And that's really the point of the legislation, is to get you to think about going somewhere where you might not have ever thought to put capital before.
Okay, so a criticism of sort of government action often is that it distorts markets. So Russ, are we just going to see a bunch of bad real estate deals here? Like, is that really what we're fostering? I mean, the tax policy created indirectly the S&L crisis, right, in the 80s. Like, how is this different?
Well, I think you are going to see a bunch of bad real estate deals, but I also think that it's not so much the tax policy that's going to drive it. I think that there's always going to be bad real estate deals. And the first thing that you want to think about when you invest in an opportunity zone is to make sure that it's fundamentally a good real estate deal. And so out of the 8,700 zones that there are around the country, just because Pittsfield, Massachusetts, not to pick on Pittsfield, Massachusetts, or Ellsworth, Maine is in an opportunity zone, doesn't mean that the tax policy will make those good investments from a real estate perspective or a place where you want to locate your business. And so when you think about this policy, I think what it does is it accelerates capital to places that you would not have normally thought about putting capital in, because it would have been a little harder to attract that capital. And so I think that's the great benefit of having the public sort of private partnership in this, is that the incentives are correct, but don't make an investment just because of the tax policy. If you do that, it'll be like integrated resources or some of these other master limited partnerships of the 80s that were depreciation driven and not fundamentally good real estate deals. So you just have to be careful about how you make those decisions.
So John, Sean Parker was a big financier, right, and sort of intellectual, leader of this. And I think of Silicon Valley as being ground zero for opportunities on investing, right? Because this is about unlocking capital, right? We have all that people that have those large stock positions, and there's no social utility, right, for someone owning $100 billion of Google stock. We've seen states throughout the country conform to the federal tax code. So what that means for the crowd, if you're a resident of New York, these benefits that I referred earlier, the deferral, the reduction, and not paying gains on your investment, that operates on both the federal and state level, and almost every state is on board with that. What the hell's going on in California?
That's an evergreen question for a lot of tax policy. In answering that, I want to kind of pick up on what Russ said. Of course, it's true that you don't want to make a bad investment simply because there's a opportunity zone attached to it. But we also can't think about this in a static way. The federal incentive is the starting point. States and localities are also doing their own work to either add to it or modify it, enhance it with other types of practical support, local reforms, and the communities themselves are stepping up to bring their assets together, their resources together in a different way. This is prompting a different type of behavior out of communities that have potential but have not been realizing that potential. So it's not just a static mathematics exercise of this returns more capital to the investor at the end of 10 years. It prompts a different type of ripple effect in the local communities and among investors and all the different stakeholders. In California, you see this playing out where the state is wrestling with how to conform and whether to conform. And it is the big, I think, question mark nationally, because if California conforms and really buys into this, it significantly enhances the marketplace for everybody else. You got a lot of capital gains tied up in California among taxpayers there. There's a lot of eligible projects and great communities in California that could benefit. And so they're going through that process right now. What the governor has said is they're looking at conformity on specific grounds. Clean energy and affordable and workforce housing. Those are the two starting points that they've thought about. But this is the big question in the state and local opportunity zones world right now, because if California doesn't conform, or if they make conformity so complicated and so burdensome that it undoes a lot of those design features that I mentioned earlier about the flexibility and the nimbleness of this policy, that will have a major effect on the national landscape of opportunity zones. It may be a little harder to reach Manny's $1 trillion outcome at the end of the day if California is not a leading part of that process.
So California, as you said, is under enormous pressure. They have the highest state tax in the United States, not counting the surcharges. And I just talked to the governor's office on Friday, and right now they're moving towards conforming for all California projects. Because their fear is, look, if I'm in Silicon Valley, I'm moving to Salt Lake City. I can move to Austin in 10 seconds. It's a huge, huge country. And I said to him, look, this is another example of tragedy of the commons that happens all the time in societies, where California, which is by far the richest state in the United States, is going to say, look, it's only good for California. Well, we have states that are struggling, Ohio, Illinois, Connecticut, state after state. And so if California ends up conforming just for California, fine, that's good, but that's not really what should be done, because you need leadership. New York State took the point of view, we're going to conform, and we're going to conform for any project in the United States. We don't recognize capital gains, but they did take the big picture approach. And most states are taking the big picture approach.
So as was referenced earlier, the Treasury regs are very important in terms of providing rules of the road, and we just received the second set. And I guess, Dan, my question to you would be, again, it's your fault that it took so long. What was the sort of one or two key takeaways from the last set of regs?
Well, to Manny's earlier point about businesses, I think we did do a good job of outlining in the regs how the opportunity zone concept can be applied to operating businesses. We did that by providing extensive treatment on how leasing would work, which will allow you to be able to take an existing business and substantially expand it in the context of an opportunity zone. We answered some of the questions about how do you source income, which was another issue with respect to operating businesses. So we did a number of things that help business formation in opportunity zones, which is what is important. And I'd say that's the most important thing we did.
So I think it's appropriate we follow the crypto panel, because I've heard op zones compared, like, is this like the new crypto? As I was telling John, I don't think it is, because while prostitution might be the oldest profession of all time, this is real estate construction, which is probably the second oldest. So this is construction with a tax overlay. But the question I have for you, Russ, is have prices already gone up? In other words, who's going to get the benefit here? Are the investors going to get the benefit, or do people who own properties in op zones, are they realizing the benefit, and have they already realized the benefit?
I think certainly prices have gone up in certain parts of the country. Some were before the op zone, they were designated as op zones because they didn't necessarily need to be designated as op zones. Certainly when the regs came out, first set prices have also risen in those markets. But I think the answer is that's fine on one hand. That's part of the public policy side of the decision. You want to increase the tax base to some of these underserved communities. The key question is you shouldn't be overpaying in those places, right? You should make sure that your assumptions are realistic from a practical standpoint. Again, there's billions of dollars of opportunities out there. I mean, we currently maintain a deal list that has over $6 billion of opportunities on it. We're not going to do all of them. Not all of them will make it through the filter in terms of a place to put capital. But so I'm not worried about price rise. I'm just worried about what are the assumptions that are made when you're making an investment. Any deal that you go into and you make a 3 or 4% growth rate assumption is going to look good at the end of 10 years. Any deal that you put a bunch of leverage on it and the leverage works is going to look good at the end of 10 years. And so the question is make sure that your first job is don't make too aggressive assumptions when you look at these things. Invest in markets where you think there's job growth, population growth, and affordability. And I think over that 10-year time period, you'll probably do well. You need a little bit of a forward look, which is okay. I mean, if you think about it, America 20 years ago or 30 years ago was a country of 200 million people. Today, we're a country of 300+ million people. We grow at the rate of 2.5 to 3 million people every year and have since the 1960s. Where are those people going? My home state of Connecticut, I don't think there's going to be as many people moving to my home state at the present time as there are in the state of Florida. State of Florida has 800 to 900 people a day that move into the state of Florida. So if you're thinking about where you're going to invest, you want to invest in some of those markets that are out there. And so I don't care about price rise because there's lots of stuff to do. The question is make sure your assumptions going in are the right assumptions as best as you can predict or forecast.
Manny, do you think the money's going to go to all the same places? In other words, Charlotte, Jacksonville, Austin, Salt Lake City, Portland. I mean, we're all looking at the same things, right? We're investing in real estate. We want to go where there's population growth, as Russ said, where there's economic growth. So aren't we all going to be looking at the same places in the capital? And so there's two questions there. One is, what does that mean for returns? And relatedly, which is John's more area of interest, in terms of social impact, is it going to be much narrower than we might otherwise hope?
Initially, there will be, the first mover advantage is to go to where the intellectual capital is. Having said that, it is going to rural places. We're going to Jasper County in South Carolina right now. We're building $250 million of warehouses. It's 7 miles from the port of Savannah, which is the fastest growing port in North America. Nobody can compete against the port in North America. And this is a county of 3,000 people. We're Disney World going to Orlando. We're doing this project in a county that has 3,000 people. So it is going to have a much, much bigger effect than people think. And again, it's going to have a business impact. Businesses will choose to invest in different places for lots of different reasons. And if you nudge them in a certain way, they will go to the depressed areas, or they will go to underserved areas. And the business piece is so powerful that everybody in America is going to use it for their business. I'll make two predictions. One, if this program, when it is successful, when you look at Puerto Rico, which is all an opportunity zone, you'll look at it no different than you look at Hawaii. And the second concept is, I think when people see the impact 5-6 years from now, that they will go back and think about giving the economic prize in Nobel Prize Economics really to the group, John Lettieri's group and Sean Parker's group that put this together 8 years ago. And the press has to understand this is not a Trump program. This is a bipartisan program. It will have a massive, massive impact.
John, I just want you to know.
Can anyone nominate if you can write that in?
Absolutely. But this is, I don't understand. Look, Polk was the president not in the Civil War, in the Mexican-American War. It's a simple thing to understand. This started 8 years ago, not 1 year ago, not 6 months ago, and it's a massive bipartisan effort. And to have it labeled over and over again, this is some kind of Trump program, it doesn't make any sense.
Right. Well, I look at the thing that makes this bipartisan, I mean, if we really look at it, is it's a tax incentive which goes to rich people. Rich people tend to be Republican. The money is going to places where Democrats tend to live, right? We're seeing a lot of it going into cities, so the mayors are embracing it, right? The city's mayors. So it's, in that regard, it's incredibly well designed. But where it might not be as well designed, I want to ask you this question, John. Brooklyn, Oakland, Hollywood, California, LA Arts District. There are a lot of areas. The Four Seasons in Palo Alto is an opportunity zone. Like, how did that happen? How is that good for the program?
Yeah, so the fundamental trade-off that was made here in terms of the selections was Congress set the guidelines in terms of areas must meet a certain criteria, but they gave the decision to down-select among those eligible places to governors. And it's worth taking a step back to look at how governors did with their authority, because they could have skated very close to the line in general and picked places that just barely qualified, or they could have gone towards higher need places in general. So you mentioned some of the outliers, and I agree that those shouldn't have been opportunity zones. But if you look at opportunity zones as an asset class of places, the average poverty rate is 29%. The median family income's in the low 40s. The educational attainment is terrible. There are more adults without a high school diploma in opportunity zones than there are adults with a bachelor's degree in opportunity zones. The lifespan, the average lifespan is 4 years shorter for opportunity zone residents than the rest of the country. So as a cohort, these are high need places. And I'd say we spend a lot of time in the data. We look at the zones selected. Somewhere around 95% withstand any scrutiny you want to give them in terms of did they deserve to be, or did they fit with the spirit of the program. That other 5%, there's some iffy spots. That's the trade-off of a decentralized program where governors and state and local leaders were given a lot of the agency here and put under the microscope. And they deserve to be put under the microscope for any selections they made that were not up to par. But in general, we shouldn't get distracted by the outliers. We should think about the number of places that have been disinvested for years, have tremendous untapped potential, and now have this tool that they haven't ever had before. They have a tool that's much more powerful than the other tools that they've had before, and that gives them a chance to thrive in a way and to access capital in a way that they haven't before.
Yeah.
The areas that you mentioned are already getting a lot of capital, and they're already pretty crowded markets. So I'm not sure that there's a lot of new opportunity in some of the places that people often call out. But even with that, that's kind of the leakage of a national program. The national program is going to be much broader and much more significant than any one zone or any one project. And so as frustrating as it can be, I think we got to have the blinders on a little bit to getting distracted by outliers and focus on this much bigger national initiative that's going to play out over the next 10, 15, 20 years in literally thousands of communities around the country, most of which pass the eyeball test with flying colors.
Yeah. I wanted to say to that, you know, there are certainly some communities where it's going to be easier to do deals early on, and those are the outliers that you're speaking of. But what I think is most important for folks to remember is you have through the end of 2026 to be able to do deals in opportunity zones. So that gives you a lot of time to thoughtfully put together packages that will really help to redevelop some of these low-income areas. You shouldn't let the early, easy deal keep you from looking for the long-term impact that this can have at some of those harder-to-reach communities.
Right. So one thing I don't think we mentioned is that on the real estate side, you have to do either development, ground-up development, or very substantial redevelopment, right? And we're limited to, what is it, 12% of the country, the app zones, approximately. So my question to you, Russ, is to invest in opportunity zones, you got to do development or redevelopment, which is the hardest thing to do in real estate. You're limited to 12% of the country. The more challenging places, like these incentives exist for a reason, and then Dan imposed all these crazy rules on you. It's going to make it even harder. So relative to a private equity real estate fund where you are not constrained, for the investors in the crowd, how much worse are you going to do in an op zone fund versus if you weren't constrained in these ways? In other words, you know, what's the return going to be that's then going to be amplified?
Yeah, I don't think about it being necessarily worse return. I think about it more about flexibility in tying up your capital. So if you think, you know, you shouldn't invest in an opportunity zone unless you're going to keep your capital in there for 10 years. We are still going to look for deals that we can, in our best underwriting or best estimation, will be able to generate a mid-teens sort of gross return on that side of the equation. But obviously, if you do a deal in a shorter time period and you flip it or turn it or sell it sooner, then you have more flexibility to do other things. And so I think on one hand, it gives you a benefit, but I'm not sure that it's worse or better. I mean, most of the reason that private equity doesn't do development is development inherently in itself takes a long time to stabilize. And so most capital, to your point earlier, most capital doesn't want to have their capital locked up for longer than 2, 3, 4, 5 years. In our normal course of funds, on the institutional side, we underwrite deals for sort of a 5-year hold. Some turn sooner, some take a little bit longer. On the opportunity zone side, we underwrite things for a 10-year hold. But think about that on another level. It gives me tremendous flexibility. If I want to attract a supermarket to an underserved neighborhood, if I want to attract a Wegmans or a Publix or a Stop and Shop, and I think it's a great neighborhood and I think it's coming along and I think it meets the public policy side of the equation in terms of they could really use a supermarket, but that a corporation doesn't want to go there, I can build a supermarket. I can say to them, you know what, for the first 3 years, don't pay me any rent. For the next 3 years, just pay me percentage rent. I can back-end load my deal because I'm going to build that building all cash. I'm not going to use leverage in that side of it. That reduces my risk in that. It gives the tenant flexibility to decide whether they're going to survive or not. Again, we have to do the macro. We have to look at the data first to get comfortable with that location. But that flexibility where my investor doesn't need his or her capital back in that first 5-year time period gives my side of the equation a lot of flexibility to do some great things. And so I think from a public policy and investment standpoint, that works out great. And because of the structure also, you want to have most of your income back-end loaded. You want to push it into the capital gain side. If it comes in ordinary income, you're paying ordinary income on it. So you don't need that ordinary income. Let's back-end load it. And so that, I think, is a great flexibility as long as the capital, the investor knows what they're getting into. Okay? Don't invest in an opportunity zone, in my opinion, just for the tax benefits.
So notwithstanding making fun of Dan, we actually were very happy with the regs, and they've been very supportive of the program. But Manny, we have a presidential election coming up. So what happens if Bernie Sanders gets elected president and the new Treasury Department is populated with people who do view this as a Trump program for better or worse? Like, we're just talking about possible risks here. So let's play out that risk.
Well, obviously that's a real risk. You know, to make long-term political judgments in almost any society is gotten harder and harder to do. And I don't know what Bernie Sanders' position is on opportunity zones, but to the extent that it can take over the long term a broken city like Baltimore and make it healthy, then that's a tremendous plus. We see what just a few people were able to accomplish in Detroit. But the political risk that you're going to have a complete change means it will not be as large as I say. But all projects that are done are grandfathered. But obviously that is a political risk that the program is not this massive tsunami of change, of job creation. And that is a risk, and same risk you take walking across the street every day.
I can't see the program being outright eliminated because of its bipartisan support. I also don't see that there's a lot of risk in a higher capital gains tax rate later, even though that might be something that a different administration might advocate. You might note that Congress very rarely changes the rate of taxation on capital gains.
This was a bipartisan approach. We just saw Pamela Harris and Senator Rubio introduce a bill to expand opportunity zones to all disaster areas, which wasn't thought through because disaster areas are done by county. So, of course, it included all of Florida and all of California.
Where's he from?
So, John, since we're here to try to get you the Nobel Prize, okay, we need to be able to measure.
This is like the last panel. Do you have money you want to put up?
I'm going to go to Stockholm for the ceremony. I don't know. Do I have to put up money?
I'm liking this panel more and more.
I'll match whatever you're putting up, Manny, all right? How do we measure this, right? Because I think one of the criticism has been is that sort of the measurement requirements of the original legislation, right, were stripped out and, again, Dan's fault, again, weren't reincorporated through the Treasury regs.
I can speak to this after he does.
I don't think we should blame Dan for this one. That he was dealt a tough hand on congressional intent. The short story of why the measurement rules were taken out is really a boring one, which is the arcane rules of the Senate, the way that tax reform was passed, procedurally stripped out things that are not budgetarily necessary. That piece of the law was not budgetarily necessary, so it dropped. I'll say as an advocate, I'm hopeful that Treasury will come up with a reporting framework that provides transparency, allows us to track over time. The White House has established an interagency council on opportunity zones, and part of their mandate is measurement of what happens in the communities and actually what's the effect of being designated in opportunity zones. This gets to the point I was making earlier. The effect of being designated is more than just the transaction benefit of the incentive. It is sparking something really special in communities around the country where they are looking at their assets and their opportunities differently because of that designation, and they're pulling together and actually getting more out of the sum of their parts. So I think that's something we need to understand over time. What was the effect of this policy on the way that communities behaved, and how did they prosper or not prosper over time as a result? Because again, it's leading to local zoning and permitting reforms. It's leading to local tax and regulatory reforms. It's leading to other types of incentives and other types of support for these communities. It's directing more than just capital. It's actually getting a lot more philanthropic capital off the sidelines, and I think hopefully we're going to see a lot more of that in the years to come. So that's something we have to capture and measure, because if we don't do that, we can't iterate that into the next policy, the next version of opportunity zones or whatever comes next. We tend to do these things once every 20 years. I hope we can do it more quickly and on a more refreshed basis than once every generation. But if we're going to do it, we need to understand how it works and how to iterate these policies and refine them over time, so that, of course, a big national policy is going to have its imperfections. The data is going to help us weed away those imperfections over time and get it right.
We got 29 seconds, Manny. I'm going to throw it to you. Who have been the first mover investors in op zones?
The first mover investors have been banks and corporations, and then some funds. We have $550 million of pieces going up. But I think you'll see, as John said, this massive multiplier impact. We're getting different states talk to us about how to take advantage of it. Every large foundation in the United States is looking at it. Look, this is a way to move the needle a mile, 10 miles, not 1 inch at a time. So there is this massive multiplier impact that has nothing to do with just the tax benefits. It has to do with momentum.
Well, thank you very much. This was fun. That's us on op zones.
All right.
Thanks, Dan.